The word history, as you may know, comes from Greek, and it means, so historie is the word used by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who is this 5th century writer, intellectual guy who writes this really long book called that we now call the Histories. But when he uses that word, he's the first person we know of to apply it to a study of the past. And it means an inquiry. It's related to words that have to do with like judging, like a legal case. So it's like he's sifting all the different versions of what happened before and deciding which one makes the most sense and what we can learn from it. That's the beginnings of what history is as like an intellectual exercise and a way of approaching the world.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Sam Blankenship. I won't go into the article here. I will apologize up front to you out there listening to me. I adjust my mic several times in this, and I can't get the noise of me messing with, there's like a spring deal here, and yeah, I'm really sorry. Yeah. There's not much more I can say about that. It's just, learning to stop practicing bad habits, I guess, is kind of the takeaway. I don't think I do that as much. I certainly don't do it. I certainly don't do it when my mic is on anymore. I don't know what possessed me to do it as many times as it happens on this day that I recorded my conversation with Sam Blankenship. So yeah, I'll let that be that. I'm excited about the conversation, but I apologize for my disruption of my own podcast. So that said, if you want to reach out to me and get a hold of me for any reason, feedback, guest suggestions, or just your unmitigated wrath toward a stranger anonymously, you can do that at my email address, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. That's all one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. You can also follow me and send comments, subscriptions, ratings, all kinds of things across multiple different social media platforms that should be linked in the show notes for you. And if you really, really, really are enthusiastic about supporting the podcast beyond just downloading and listening and helping contribute numbers to the growth or spreading the word to your friends or your parasocial relationships, head on over to patreon.com. The link for that is also in the show notes, and chip in $5 a month. And that is the best way to help me pursue the vision that I have for this. Yeah. So that's all I have to say up top. I will see you guys on the backside of the episode. Okay. Thanks. Take care. Sam Blankenship, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat about Ezra-Nehemiah.
Yeah, well, you spent a long time writing the article, so I hope you're excited. Before we get going on that, though, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor of classics, so my field is Greek and Roman stuff at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. But I'm working on a major research project right now that's brought me into making comparisons and contrasts with material in the Hebrew Bible.
So you are not, just so you know, you are not the first classicist who has jumped into Hebrew Bible stuff on this podcast.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So look, the whole thing about this is like, what's going on behind biblical texts? How do people engage with biblical texts? What's the best way to understand it? So like, you're right at home here.
That sounds great.
But we're going to be discussing your article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, Persian-Style Historiography in Ezra-Nehemiah. And so the first question I sent you, you mentioned early on, and I might mess this up, Arnaldo Mamagliano. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. So you talk about his contributions to historiography. Can you, what does that mean, and how is it relevant to Ezra-Nehemiah and Persian-style historiography?
Sure. So Arnaldo Mamigliano, he's Italian, so they don't pronounce the G in gli. So Mamigliano was an Italian scholar of the last century, and he was a classicist, but he was also Jewish. So when he was dismissed from the University of Turin, where he had a position because he was Jewish during the fascist regime under Mussolini. I think under Mussolini, but at some point in the fascist years. And he moved to the United Kingdom and also would go to, I think, the University of Chicago. So he also had a connection in the United States. But he's considered a giant in the field of classics. And he brought his intense knowledge of Jewish literature and tradition into contact with his also immense learning and control of Greek and Roman sources. And he was thinking about history writing in Greek and Roman traditions, but also sort of bringing it into conversation with different traditions and different cultures that Greeks and Romans came into contact with. So this includes Jewish thought and literature. It also includes Persian thought and literature. So, for example, are there any impacts of Zoroastrianism on the way that Greeks approach their world and approach their past? So he was sort of, it's become more common to do this sort of cross-cultural study now, but I think he was one of the real pioneers of it. What does it have to do with my project? In the 60s, he noticed and sort of sketched out ways that the ancient Greeks start writing about their history, and then Second Temple Jewish writers write their history in a new way. And the connecting thread seems to be that both are exposed to the Achaemenid Persian Empire at about the same time. So he was trying to look for the effects of Persian culture on these emergent or continuing ways of writing history. So in the Greek sphere and in the Jewish sphere, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It makes sense. So I have a pretty long commute. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I also intermittently pause them and then I'll say talk to, but really I'm ranting at myself. And I caught myself the other day using the word history in a way. So I'm not done with my undergraduate, but I am a history major, using the word history with myself. So the only reason anyone is going to know is because I'm self-identifying here today incorrectly. And so I figured you would be a good person to talk to about that, because we're talking about historiography here. I would like to take a moment to kind of peel some of the layers of that onion. So I think there's a concept of history as just like everything that happened before us, but that's not really accurate, is it?
I think that's right. Or you're right that is a simplification of what history is. The word history, as you may know, comes from Greek, and it means, so historie is the word used by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who is this 5th century writer, intellectual guy who writes this really long book called that we now call the Histories. But when he uses that word, he's the first person we know of to apply it to a study of the past. And it means an inquiry. It's related to words that have to do with like judging, like a legal case. So it's like he's sifting all the different versions of what happened before and deciding which one makes the most sense and what we can learn from it. So that, I think, is what we that's the beginnings of what history is as like an intellectual exercise, and a way of approaching the world. So what do you think of that, as a definition of history?
I don't know. We'll find out. We'll find out. Well, I don't know. I do these things in pieces. So there's the inquiry part of it to find out what happened, but then there's something between the inquiry, the questions you're asking, interrogating or collecting data, however you want to characterize that, because that could be a pretty complex. And then there's what you write down. So a shower thought thing that I'll often do is like if I were to write a history of this or that presidential administration, would the best place be to look at like, oh, all the legislation, all the executive orders, and all of the administrative documents that were produced, and then I would work from there. So that would be me collecting the data, and then eventually I would, hopefully write a book. But there's something that happens in between there. So what fills that bucket? So like inquiry, product. What fills the middle bucket?
I would say for someone like Herodotus, who lives in a world where there's not tons of the documents that you can proceed from, so there's not this idea of documentary evidence as necessarily the sort of the scientific be all and end all that we sort of think of it as today. Instead, he would go around and engage with different oral traditions. I don't know that he thought of them as oral traditions as such, but he would go around, or at least the way he presents his activities is that he would go around asking people from this city state or that city state or from Egypt. So like, what happened here? What are your traditions? What is this statue over here? What is this commemorating? And then he seems to collect all of that information, all of this oral information, sift it, and then judge what's the most plausible, what he thinks is foolish. He'll even say, this doesn't make sense to someone using reason, or to someone who trusts hearsay, or to someone who trusts their eyes. So those are his sort of criteria. This is or is not plausible. So dealing with different types of evidence in the absence of having these sort of documents, basically.
Okay. Yeah, and that is a very, I guess, culturally instantiated point of view for me to be like, oh, I'll go to all the documentation. So obviously in the ancient world, they didn't necessarily have that. But that makes me think of, in your article, you mentioned charts as a kind of technology. And this is, I like to make jokes about shovels being technology, and people will laugh and like, no, like at some point people were digging holes with their hands, and then a guy comes along and he's like, hey, I'm going to use this, and then you'd be stupid to not use that anymore. Charts are very much that kind of thing, but it's a technology that someone innovated. I don't take it that you're saying it was necessarily innovated in this period, but it was certainly utilized, right?
That's right. So when I think about charts, as this category and this technology, it's something that goes all the way back to the Sumerian period. So in the beginnings of writing, people are using this kind of format to document stuff, usually for administrative purposes. But because Greeks and then the people living in Judea or in Babylonia who are Jewish and who had been deported there, they're experiencing charts. In the Greek case, probably for the first time, and in the Jewish case, like maybe not for the first time, but right now, in the period that Ezra-Nehemiah is about, in the context of the Persian Empire. So, like when they see charts, they're always Persian charts. And the other thing that I think is noteworthy about these charts as a style of administration is that the Persians do it obsessively. There's this great, I don't think I mentioned it in the article, but there's this really fantastic letter that was found on a piece of parchment in Egypt, and it's for the repair of an Egyptian boat. but it's being paid for or sort of overseen by the Persian administration. And they make a chart of this many pieces of wood, these many, this many beams of this type of wood, this many beams of this type of wood, and they actually count the number of nails that they need for boat repair. So they're like incredibly painstaking in their use of the chart to sort of document every little thing in their empire, to an extent that I think is not maybe the case in some of these previous empires or kingdoms that use the same technology. And then so my point is that I think it becomes, as a technology, it becomes associated with Persian administration. And so that's sort of in the background of Greek sort of attitudes about the chart and these Jewish versions of charts that show up in Ezra-Nehemiah. In my view, like, they're thinking about this as a technology that has something to do with Persia.
I don't think this came up in his book, but I remember reading Tom Holland's Persian Fire years ago, and I didn't know really anything about the Persian Empire, but he talks about Persian administration being so good with respect to their roadways, that they would have like this proprietary road system, and you needed a token or whatever to go from this waypoint to that waypoint, and you could only be doing it on official business, and how efficient that made them. And this kind of, you are bringing to mind, I'm one of them to a lesser extent, but some of the Excel nerds that I work with, the guys who, and it is almost exclusively guys, sorry, who get really excited when a problem is proposed that they can create a spreadsheet for. And is that so? How closely related are the charts you're describing to the kind of charts that we would be looking at in, say, Excel?
So I use the term chart a little bit loosely because Excel has those really nice looking columns, and
yeah, it does.
They're easy to read, super legible, super adaptable to different scenarios. But when I think about charts, some of the Persian charts that I look at are laid out like that. So they do have different columns with each type of data, like we would be used to. But I also think it's kind of like with your Excel nerds, it's kind of a state of mind that you can categorize different things in a useful way and sort of master and manipulate data to your benefit, or not to your benefit, but like in a way that's useful to you. So I think it's as much of a mentality as it is a format. And the mentality kind of sticks around, if not necessarily the exact same format.
So it's kind of driven by desired outcomes.
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. That is helpful. So they know what they want to achieve, repair this boat, and they want to do that with the fewest pieces of wood, the fewest nails, whatever else. I don't know. I'm not a shipwright. That you need to do that. And so once they identify what is needed, they know these are the resources we've used. Okay. So how does that work for historiography?
So this is where I think the mentality of the chart is really useful and interesting. There are Persian imperial official texts written by the king, or written in the king's voice, but probably by his scribes, that are meant to present the king in a certain way to the kingdom, to the whole empire. And one of the techniques that I think is that shows up kind of surprisingly is the use of the chart. There'll be like a list or a chart of all the people that are members of the empire. In other words, like Egyptians and Medians and Elamites, and so they're kind of charted in this format. But it's interesting to me that it shows up in a text that's supposed to be about the present and the past of what the empire is. So that kind of also like begs questions about what history writing is. Like, does it count if you're writing about the present? Does it only count if you're writing about the past? But in these imperial texts that are making claims about what the empire is, so both in present time and in past time, charts show up in certain places. Another example that I really like is in this long text where King Darius I, who's a usurper, explains why he should be king, and how he crushed all the rebels. So people who were reasonably like, I don't know, you're not supposed to be king. He calls them rebels to sort of project it back on them. But he narrates, first of all of these different rebellions against him that he crushes. But then afterwards, he makes a chart of them. He's like, okay, there were eight guys or 9 guys who rebelled against me. The first one was his category number 1 is his name. Category number 2 is where he was from. And category number 3 is like the specific claim that he made that I had to fight against. And so he makes virtually a table or a chart of all the stuff that he told us already in narrative format. So I think it's really weird that it shows up in this historiographical context. So sorry, I think I lost the thread of the original question.
Oh,
but that's
no,
what got me thinking about.
That's why you're here. No, don't worry about it. If you keep me entertained, I won't ever know. Yeah, you could completely answer a different question, but if what you say is interesting, I won't care. So kind of 3 questions pop into my head, and you can answer any or none of them if you want. So one, and the first 2 are kind of related. One, were there groups who were included in any of these lists that they would have objected to that inclusion? Were there groups who were excluded from these lists and they would have, and there was some kind of political or administrative reason that they were excluded, who should have been on the list? And then 3, what were alternative or antecedent versions of a kind of imperial historiography to talk about what the empire consisted of?
Yeah, these are all great questions. For who's on the list, there's usually a standard number of about 24 different lands or peoples that get included in the list. But it doesn't include everybody that we know was part of the empire. For example, there's not a mention of Judeans. They're just kind of in this bigger category of like Babylonians or people that live in the province across the river. So there's a lot of sort of subgroups that get lumped into these bigger these bigger groups of 24. The other thing is that we think that Persian control sort of ebbs and flows over the territory that they're involved in. And so, for example, the Persian lists claim to have control of Yauna, which basically means Greeks. But we know from other sources, like from Greek sources, that yes, at times they were in control of Ionian Greece. So so like the easternmost part of the Greek-speaking world, yes, they are in control of that sometimes, and they're fully incorporated into the empire. But they're not in charge of all Greeks. So they never conquer Athens and Sparta, famously. So to say we're in charge of Greeks is the situation is more complicated than what shows up on this label in the chart. So that's sort of why I think this counts as history writing, because you're making a specific claim about what your empire is. I don't know as much about the precedents for this. I know that in these inscriptions, there's a choice of which languages to use that's meant to appeal to audiences that might be familiar with, say, Assyrian propaganda or royal texts, inscriptions. But I'm not sure if, say, the Assyrians would make lists of all their conquered peoples. It may well be the case that that's the inspiration for the Persians doing this in turn. But I just don't know that material as well.
So I'm thinking in terms of like like I know Lewis and Clark went out on their expedition and they were really land surveyors was like the crux of what they were out there to do, and then they get credit for this exploration piece of it, but that seems to be culturally motivated by a kind of a commercial a culture of commerce, right? Like the state exists in this context to mediate disputes. What would be the driving motivator? Is it like, I don't know, imperial authority? Like, how do we understand what motivates how they're describing what the empire consists of?
So there's really interesting work that's been done on this by Bruce Lincoln, a scholar of religions and especially of Zoroastrianism and the religion of the Persian Empire, which is a huge fraught question. But he's written some interesting things about it. The way he has explained how this works is that the kings of Persia see themselves as fulfilling a basically religious mandate to re-achieve the perfect state of the world as it originally was created by Ahura Mazda. And bad stuff has happened to the world since then, and the Persian kings are going to make it right, and they're going to spread over the whole world a new paradise that sort of re-inaugurates the original perfect paradise. So there is this idea of like world domination, basically. That's like this imperial religious mandate that the Persian kings seem to be viewing themselves as champions of.
So kind of like Christendom.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Or manifest destiny is a way to describe it too.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think Christendom came to my mind because people are using that term again, which is weird to me. That I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I won't take you off on that. That's that's a digression you don't need to deal with. So okay, so we have that motivation of they're trying to reestablish something, but then we're seeing kind of I guess a Judahite adaptation, like co-opting. I'm not really sure how to describe. Okay, I'll be quiet. I feel like you're nodding, so I feel like you understand where I'm going. Do you want to pick up the ball from there?
Sure. So one of the ways in which I think history writing, both in the Greek sphere and in the Judahite sphere, changes along the lines of Momigliano's original sketches, is that some of the people in or outside of the empire realize or that some of the claims being made by the Persian kings aren't true. Or they don't want them to be true. So, for example, if you're a Greek and you live in Athens, you don't want to become part of the Persian Empire. You're not on board with this manifest destiny thing. If you're stuck in the empire, if you're stuck with it, like in Yehud, so if you're a Judahite living there and your province is just part of the Persian Empire now, you might want to speak back to empire by using its sort of its discourses and its ways of presenting itself to present your own community with its own sort of rich history and your own beliefs and traditions in a way. So I think that the Jewish writers, I think, are conscious of these Persian ways of presenting themselves, and they use them because they're associated with the power of empire. So they're I would like to use the word co-opting that you suggested. They do co-opt these modes of self-presentation, but they're using it to package their higher truth instead of the Persian higher truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so they're somehow both submitting to an imperial authority, or I guess paying homage to an imperial authority, but casting it in the light of this is only happening because it was facilitated, allowed, or desirable to Israel's God.
Right. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Is yes, these imperial structures exist, but as you say, they were they're authorized by God, who's looking out for us as well.
And I say this in the most benign way possible. I'm not saying this to be judgmental or inflammatory. So in that sense, it is a kind of propaganda, but like a bi-directional propaganda, right?
Right. I think it can be. You can you can okay. Well, another way of approaching this, I would say, is that it's been recently shown and emphasized in several different studies that the people who are writing Ezra and Nehemiah know about these Persian ways of presenting themselves and presenting their administration because they work for the Persian administration. So you can use your boss's, I don't know, forms to put your own data on them, I guess. And so there is a way there is a way in which you're showing that you're competent in, that you know how you know the workings and the purposes of the Persian boss's ways of doing things, but you're using them for something better. So yeah, I think it is both.
So, I mean, this may be reductive, but if we look at it as an upward, there's a message going upward to the power structure, and then there's a message going maybe downward or outward. That part I'm not really clear on, and it's okay if you're like not interested in that. That's not really. But is there a difference? I guess, is there like a hinge point where you can tell within how the historiography is happening in Ezra-Nehemiah that there could be a different perception laterally or downward as opposed to upward?
Yes, I think that's well put.
Thank you. That's all. No, I'm just.
So Ezra and Nehemiah is written partly in Hebrew and partly in Aramaic, and Aramaic is one of the imperial languages. But I don't think so. As for the sort of upward thing, the way I understand what you mean is that like, how is this going to look to a Persian overlord? And I think they're not interested and they're not reading it probably. So that demands, I think, that we wonder who the audience is. Like, who is the downward audience that this is directed towards, like within the community. And one idea is that there's a specific group of Judahites who are on board with Persian administration, and they justify it in terms of Jewish religion or Jewish beliefs and traditions, let's say, because there are people that aren't okay with Persian imperial administration. And it's also a way of maybe justifying their own position within the community. So others have had the thought that the people that wrote Ezra-Nehemiah, or the person who wrote Ezra-Nehemiah, is both someone on the payroll of the Persian king and the provincial administration, but also works for the Jerusalem temple, as opposed to other religious centers, for example. And so, like, tying in governmental authority with temple authority is one sort of strategy for projecting your power against other members of the community, or like having a disagreement with them. And not everyone's on board with that, as we can see from other biblical texts that deal with Persia. And they're like, Persia's not good.
Okay, so I guess this kind of goes back to overall desired outcomes or imperial strategic concerns. And I'm thinking again of Tom Holland. And look, I'm sorry to keep throwing that out there. I don't know. But in Persia, he kind of describes it as it's a syncretistic empire where, like, yeah, as long as you pay your bills and you don't cause trouble, we don't care. So is that so Ezra-Nehemiah is attempting to, hey, we're going back and we got permission. And so the empire is co-signing, but they're only doing that because our God facilitated that. Cool. We're going to go back and we're going to cooperate with them because that's what our God obviously wants, because that's what they want. So they don't care about that message unless it's trying to be like openly subversive, right? That's
Right.
what you're
That's what
saying?
I would think.
Okay. And they're trying to cooperate or participate, they being Ezra-Nehemiah and whoever the cadre around the authors of Ezra-Nehemiah are. They're trying to be cooperative with this power structure because they think that's the best thing to get them their homeland back, kind of.
Right. I think so.
Okay.
And so they go to the trouble of saying, well, Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. That means like he's the advisor to the king, and he gets like he and Ezra both are given like travel authorizations, or they're given or like they have jobs in the government. Uh, or Nehemiah has a job in the government. Ezra has like the travel authorization and stuff. And the Persians, by the way, they're going to give us tons of uh, they're going to give us like basically a huge fund to maintain the temple and the sacrifices. So yeah, I think that is the picture that is being painted.
So on the one end, it's for the Persians, it's an acceptable level of autonomy, and on the other side, it's an acceptable level of cooperation.
Right.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I want to make sure that I'm tracking on that. I think genealogies are really interesting. Why are they so important?
It's such a typical way and cross culturally common way of expressing belonging or identity, or saying that you're somebody, like maybe somebody important. Uh, so when I wrote this article, one thing that I received some pushback on from the readers that give you the first round of comments before they agree to publish it is that there's already genealogical stuff in Jewish traditions. So why does this, how can you say that this has anything to do with Persia? And I think that's valid. There is already a sense of genealogical belonging to the different tribes of the Israelites, for example. So there's already a tradition there. But one reason that I like to think about any impacts that Persian uh, obsession with genealogy might be on the minds of the writers of Ezra-Nehemiah is that Darius I makes a big deal out of his genealogy because he's not really in line to be king at all. So he makes up this genealogy that goes beyond sort of the more typical, okay, this is my father and this is my grandfather, so I belong to this cool family. But instead, he makes this incredibly elaborate genealogy where he's the ninth out of nine kings who are kind of like, this is my brother's, or not my, this is my father's brother, and we're all related to Cyrus. And Cyrus is the founder of the Persian Empire. So like that gives you a good credential to be authorized as a legitimate king. But he goes further and he says, we're not only related to Cyrus, but by the way, Cyrus has this other ancestor who's more important as the founder of our dynasty. So he makes this up. It may or may not be historically true that there's any relationship between Darius and Cyrus. But after Darius sort of makes a big deal out of this, all of his successors feel like they have to include their genealogical list in their propaganda. So the propaganda might be like, oh, look, I built this cool building. But the first part of the inscription will be like, I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, who is related to Darius, who is related to Cyrus, who's related to Achaemenes, the Achaemenid founder. So I was wondering if that's because it's such an important part of Persian self-legitimation. I was wondering if the Jewish writers also have this on their mind to construct maybe a different type of genealogy, like a priestly genealogy, which to them would, or the authors of the book would be more important than this royal genealogy, perhaps, if that makes sense.
And what, I mean, did you find that was validated, that there is a...
I think so. I think it's, so there's all those genealogical lists. Everyone's divided up in terms of where they're from and who their ancestor is in the big lists in Ezra and Nehemiah. But also Ezra is described when he appears in the text as, I think he has a seven part genealogy, but it's his genealogy as a priest rather than his genealogy as like a leader or something. So I think there is evidence to support like this interest in genealogies.
I can't remember if this is a thing that he goes into, but this is reminding me of an interview I did in the past with Nathan McDonald, and I'll refer listeners to that, where he's basically talking about priestly accumulation of power. And I know I hadn't really thought of them as their own like power block, but especially in returning and trying to rebuild a temple, you would actually want to have some kind of power as a priest if that was actually going to happen, right?
Right.
And having a genealogy that validates, even in a narrative form, that validates that enterprise would be really helpful.
Right.
Okay. So would that be, I guess, would that be a message that, and you may just say they probably wouldn't care. Would that be something that would validate them to, or their request to the Persians, or would that be something that would validate them to other Judahites?
That's a good question. I suspect that as long as they're paying their tribute and taxes, the Persians they're like, it's great, good job, keep on keeping on. But to the community, they're establishing their primacy as priests, especially in the Jerusalem temple, as opposed to other temples that you could have the option of going to. Like maybe their genealogy isn't as impressive as the Jerusalem temple priestly genealogy.
Okay.
Like that's kind of what I wonder if part of the calculus is for including this information.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still like from a year and a half, 2 years ago, I'm still trying to wrap my head around genealogies as a literary thing. And I'm not asking you to validate that, but I talked to a guy a while back about that. And that was tough too. Yeah. So as we're kind of coming up on time, I see here something that I pulled from the article I want to make sure I ask you about. So how is it you can say, quote, "We know the ideological materials were purposefully disseminated in oral, written, and pictorial forms throughout the empire"? I'm particularly interested in oral dissemination. So to say with such we know that these ideological materials were disseminated orally. How do we know that? That's such a fascinating thing to me.
It's so I can't take credit for figuring it out. But there's this fantastic book called Aspects of History and Epic in Ancient Iran, From Galmata to Waknam, which is about Darius's inscription, where he says, so we know he's a usurper, but he says, "I'm the legitimate king." And so he tells his long story, and it's written in the Bisitone inscription on Mount Bisitone in Iran. And if it had only been written on the side of this mountain where it's really high up, most people can't read, you wouldn't know the story behind his coming into power, or the story that he wants you to know and believe. So we have copies of this put into other languages and spread throughout the empire. For example, it shows up on parchment in Elephantine, in this Jewish garrison, 100 years after it's written up on the rock face. But there are sources that know about this story, even though there's not a written text that goes along with this story. So that's part of why we think there must have been an oral component to this. So Herodotus, a Greek, knows the outlines of the story. He tells a story that's pretty close to what's on the inscription that's carved up there on the rock, miles and miles away in the middle of Iran, even though he's writing either in probably Athens or maybe in his hometown of Halicarnassus in Western Turkey. So the fact that it's known by people way outside of the imperial center is one indication. Another thing that's pointed to by this guy, Emrahim Shayagan, is that even in Iran, the tradition seems to stick around into later empires. So that's part of what this title is pointing to. So the bad guy that Darius defeats and saves the empire from this bad guy, Galmata, shows up later in, I think, I forget the details, but I think Sasanian epic as Bahnam. So that's just like an updated version of his name. So that means the story was probably sort of kept around and retold so that people are aware of it centuries later. So not even in another part of the empire, but centuries later. So this broad geographical and temporal spread of this story seems to attest to the fact that this must have been told and retold in space and time, which is just so cool. And it's one of the reasons that this story has so much staying power. Yeah.
No, I wish that it were easier to find more stuff on kind of oral transmission, but a lot of people, I brought it up in one interview and he's like, that's not what I'm worried about. I'm just worried about text. Like, okay, yeah, fair enough, man. I get it. Cause that's, I mean, you basically have to look at a bunch of stuff that is, and then also just kind of, I don't know, draw inferences. Like you're saying, well, Herodotus also, and it's about structure and how content shows up, because the one dude's name changes over the centuries and it's a different character and a different empire. That stuff is a lot of fun.
Yeah,
there's no question
cool.
there.
Yes,
did you have that book there because you knew you were going to need it, or is that just like one of your top 5?
I noticed that one of your questions is what would you recommend for further reading, so I've got like a whole show and tell.
Okay, let's jump into that then.
Okay.
Where would you books, podcasts, YouTube, blogs, whatever?
So I just have books with me, but for people that are interested in any aspect of the Persian Empire, this is the first sort of modern comprehensive history of the Persian Empire that was written. It's written in 1994 in French, but luckily translated into English. So From Cyrus to Alexander, A History of the Persian Empire. It's a hefty tome. I haven't read the whole thing, but like if there's any topic that you could think of within anything you wanted to know about the Persian Empire, he deals with it. And one of the great things about this sort of grandfather of Persian studies, Pierre Briand, is that so traditionally people would just look at the Hebrew Bible and just look at Greek sources to figure out like what is this Persian Empire thing. But he looks at sort of all the available sources, so newly translated little chart texts from Persepolis, or the Persian inscriptions themselves, or just like he looks at the whole empire and all the data that's available. So that gives him this really panoptic view of the empire and what it's all about. I also recommend The Persian Empire, a corpus of sources from the Achaemenid period, which is put together by Amelie Kurt. But it's got lots of great illustrations of different Persian artifacts, as well as sort of like these original source texts that are dealt with by Briand in his big history. But this is more of like a source book.
So not a lot of explanation or analysis. It's like a reader almost.
It is, but there's really good notes that explain what you're looking at.
Okay.
So
cool.
So there is kind of commentary on all of these different sources. So that's what I would recommend for knowing what the Persian Empire is all about on its own terms. The other book that I brought along was published last year, and it's called An Empire Far and Wide: The Achaemenid Dynastic Myth and Jewish Scribes in the Late Persian Period by Mark Lucher. And it's a fantastic book because it analyzes Persian history writing, or let's say Persian propaganda, on its own terms, but then also traces the impacts that it has in a variety of Jewish texts, and shows how that happened. So like with scribes being on, scribes in the Persian imperial administration, also then going around. So that's their day job. And then their night job is writing the Bible.
I like that. So him, I follow on social media. So I like that. Okay, there's somebody I can bother. I can bug him about that book.
It's a really cool book. I highly recommend it.
Thank you for actually holding them up. Not that every guest has to do this, but that's super helpful because I try to have the show notes ready while I'm editing, and I'll just kind of throw the recommendations in there, and then I can find hyperlinks or whatever. So all of those books will be hyperlinked in the show notes for listeners who are interested. So was that it? Are there more? They don't have to be.
One more. From 2020, Laura Carlson Hasler's Archival Historiography in Jewish Antiquity deals specifically with Ezra-Nehemiah. And so this gets at like, why should we consider, or can we consider this text to be historiography? A lot of people look at sort of like the details in Ezra-Nehemiah, and some of them don't add up with historical details in the sequence that we would like them to be in based on sort of like modern standards of scientific history, that kind of thing. So why can we use this as historiography? And what she argues in this book is that basically Ezra-Nehemiah is kind of an archive of all these different texts about this period and about this experience. And they're kind of put together to make them an archive. And that is a sort of new and interesting form of historiography. Like that's an oversimplification, but that's kind of the kernel of the argument.
Okay. I'll bug her too. You don't have to, that's a good synopsis of the book, but yeah, you don't have to answer for somebody else's work. Are there any, I know you brought books, but are there any YouTube channels or podcasts out there that it's fine if there aren't?
I need to look into that more. So I need to like go discover the wild world of contributions that are not just books.
Then I'll throw a recommend. So the Biblical World, the OnScript podcast has it's a lot of archaeology, and I know they did a series of episodes working through the Epic of Gilgamesh, but Biblical World kind of focuses more on this stuff and less on theological or liturgical use of biblical texts and things like that. So listeners have heard me recommend that before, so that's no surprise to them. What do you read for fun?
For fun, I like to read novels. Actually, this is kind of goofy, and it sounds like a flex, but it's just not. I'm in a book club right now, and we're reading War and Peace together. It's awesome. Really good. You'd think it would be so dry and boring, but it's really entertaining. Lots of plot twists.
I haven't read it, but I've never heard anyone who did give a bad review. They're always like surprised, like, no, it's not that hard to read. It's really long.
Right, exactly.
What else? I mean, you said novels, so I'm gonna respect that plural. What else?
Let's see. What else have I? I'm reading Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, which is about a Iranian American poet. I'm only like 100 pages in or something. So it's interesting to think about Iran in the long term, because I spend most of my time thinking about this period from 550 BCE to until 323 BCE. So the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but like Iran has this long cultural history and a diaspora, and so it's cool to read a novel that has to do with Iranian identity.
Okay. Not that anybody asked, but I just found out. So Gregory Maguire, who wrote Wicked, there were 4 books initially were in the series. Wicked, Son of a Witch, Lion Among Men, and I think Out of Oz. Anyway, there's like a new series, and so my wife and I went to Half Price Books because I had gift cards that had just been sitting there and I hadn't used them. And I found out Gregory Maguire kept that series going, and I was really excited to find that. Or it's like a sequel series or something. I'm not as into the musical as other people because I'm kind of siloed into the book, but I really love that little fantasy universe that he made. So that's my recommendation. Putting that out there is read Gregory Maguire. He's really fun. All of his stuff just kind of rethinking, like Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, and like he does all of these. Christina Henry's another one who will do like Peter Pan, and it's like, but it's really dark. The Lost Boys is the one that it's really dark and kind of a bummer, but it's really well written. Anyway, sorry. What else?
Cool.
What else do you do to decompress?
I've taken up yoga. It's really fun.
What kind?
Trying to get back into running. So trying to not just sit at my desk reading books all the time.
What kind of yoga?
I'm not sure which type of yoga it is. There's classes at my local YMCA, and so there's a bunch of different instructors, and I think they each have a slightly different style and approach. But I really like the sort of movement aspects of. I don't know. I don't have anything like smart to say about it. I just think it's really fun.
You enjoy it. That's all you need to. I actually kind of like running, but I was telling somebody else recently, here in Texas, the best time to run is early in the morning, but that's also when it's warm, that's when there are snakes and skunks out. And that's a really good way to ruin your morning, is to not see a snake or a skunk until it's too late. More honestly, skunks are scarier to me than the snakes.
That's reasonable.
Yeah. Well, okay. You've been a good sport on this last part. So unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
It sounds good to me.
No, sorry. You know what? I forgot. Is there anything from the article you were hoping I would ask about that I didn't?
I guess I was excited to bring in like the Greek stuff that I don't talk about as much in the article, but I think we did talk about it.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's on you then. Because, yeah, whatever pops into my head, I ask. So, okay. Well, Sam Blankenship, thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and talking through this with me.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. Again, if you want to hit me up, you have feedback, input, anything like that, use my email address, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Or follow me on any of the myriad social media accounts that I have set up for the podcast. Subscribe wherever you're listening if you haven't already, or become a Patreon supporter for $5 a month. I'd like to eventually do this as a day job. So every supporter over on Patreon gets me $5 a month closer to that. Next week on the podcast, Matthew Bodie and I discuss his book, The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. If you're interested, he has a YouTube channel, and I know at least one guest that we share is Nadia Williams. This is going to be quite a bit of politics, in addition to just kind of speaking about theology and ideology generally in biblical texts like we do on this podcast. Most of the time, this one's a little bit more overtly political. So if that's not your bag, I guess my request is still download it and then just click Mark as played. That's what I do when I get overwhelmed by too many podcasts in my queue. Just say Mark as played. I know it's not a big deal, but it feels good for me to see those downloads. Yeah. So here is a quick preview of my conversation with Matthew Bodie. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
Yeah. So the Seven Mountains is a metaphor for seven areas of cultural influence that certain segments of the Christian world, mainly evangelicals and charismatics, want to retake. And I use that word retake on purpose because they believe that these seven areas of culture are under demonic or satanic or secular control. And so these are the seven areas that are most powerful in America. You can probably guess of them, but they are, sometimes I forget them, one or two of them, but they are government, religion, education, family, media, entertainment, and business. I always forget one. And so these areas these are not unique to evangelical thought. These areas are in psychology textbooks for decades. And these areas are generally the institutions, if you will, that we have in America that push us in one direction or another, that push us in secular or religious directions. And so these seven areas over the course of the last 50 years, the Christian right believes has been taken over by some sort of, it depends on how you describe it. Again, a demonic, satanic, he's at the top of the mountain, you have to dethrone him, but also it's a secular, anti-religion, anti-Christian conspiracy, if you will, to run these things so that we are no longer a Christian nation. And so to retake these mountains means to make America Christian again. And the last thing I will say is that in these areas, before I define kind of individual ones, is they work together. That is, you need all seven of these to complete the task. There have been organizations over the past 50 years that have tried to do several of these at once, education and government being the first kind of two. And there are different ways in which they try to retake them. Obviously, getting people elected to office is a government way, and taking over school boards and curriculum is the education way, but the other ones are not as clear. So, for example, again, with the government one, you want to elect people to office. Obviously, Donald Trump is the biggest example of that, but the Speaker, Mike Johnson, is a full supporter of the Seven Mountains mandate. So you want to put people in high, important places that will do God's work. But that also is not just at the federal level. That means the state level as well. You want to make states more powerful than the federal government. As I've been saying for a while, Project 2025, which is this plan to dismantle the federal government, is one of the seven mountains. It's the government mountain.